Good evening all, and welcome back to Paranoia Files. Tonight I return with a harrowing collection of true accounts from the endless stretches of American highways where something went terribly wrong. In this episode, we will traverse 8 disturbing road trip tales spanning unexplained mysteries, paranormal encounters, and true crime incidents that occurred on the open road. Each story has been meticulously compiled from first-hand testimonies of travelers who survived experiences that defy rational explanation. These are not fictional narratives designed for entertainment. These are documented encounters reported by ordinary people whose journeys became nightmares. To protect the identities of those involved, certain names and minor details have been modified, but the core events remain exactly as they were experienced. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Paranoia Files for daily true horror content that explores the darkest corners of reality. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now it is time to get comfortable and let the terror of the highway unfold. This all happened back in the summer of 2019 when I was driving cross-country from Seattle to my parents' place in North Carolina. I had just graduated college and figured it would be my last chance to do a big solo road trip before starting my career and settling into the grind of adult life. I had always been the kind of person who needed proof before I believed in anything supernatural. Ghost stories were fun to tell around campfires, but I never actually thought there was any truth to them. I considered myself rational, logical, someone who relied on science and evidence. But what happened to me on that lonely stretch of highway in Montana changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I had been on the road for about 4 days at that point, taking my time and stopping at random roadside attractions in small towns along the way. By the time I reached Montana, I was ahead of schedule, so I decided to drive through the night to make up some time. It was around 2 in the morning and I was on Highway 200 cutting through the northern part of the state. If you have never driven through Montana at night, it is an experience that is both beautiful and deeply unsettling. The darkness out there is absolute. There are no streetlights, no gas stations, no houses with warm, glowing windows. Just an endless black void on either side of the road, and your headlights carving out a small tunnel of visibility ahead of you. I had the radio on, but most stations had faded to static hours ago. I was left with my own thoughts and the hum of the engine. Despite the isolation, I felt calm. I have always enjoyed solitude, and there was something meditative about the drive. That sense of peace lasted until I saw him. At first, he was just a shape on the side of the road, illuminated briefly by my headlights. A figure standing there, arm outstretched with his thumb up in the universal gesture of a hitchhiker. My first instinct was to keep driving. I mean, who picks up hitchhikers at 2 in the morning in the middle of nowhere? But as I got closer, I could make out more details. He looked middle-aged, maybe in his 50s, wearing a button-down shirt and jeans. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his body like he had been caught in a rainstorm. But here is the thing. It had not rained. The road was bone dry and the sky was clear. Something about the desperation in his posture made me slow down. Maybe it was because I was young and still believed in helping people, or maybe it was because the isolation of the drive had made me crave human interaction, even with a stranger. Whatever the reason, I pulled over about 20 feet past him and watched in my rearview mirror as he jogged up to the passenger side door. When he opened the door and climbed in, the temperature in the car seemed to drop instantly. I told myself it was just the cold night air rushing in. But even after he closed the door, the chill remained. He did not say anything at first, just settled into the seat and stared straight ahead through the windshield. His hair was dripping wet and I could see water pooling on the seat beneath him. "Thank you for stopping," he finally said. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper, and had a strange quality to it that I cannot quite describe. It sounded distant, like he was speaking to me from the far end of a long tunnel. "No problem," I replied, trying to sound friendly despite the unease that was starting to creep up my spine. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road a ways," he said, still not looking at me. "There is a curve, a bad curve." I waited for him to elaborate, but he just kept staring ahead. I put the car back in drive and pulled onto the highway. As we drove, I tried to make conversation, asking him where he was coming from and how long he had been waiting on the side of the road. His answers were vague and unsettling. He would respond to some questions but ignore others entirely. At one point, I asked him his name, and he turned to look at me for the first time. His eyes were dark and hollow, and when he spoke, he said, "Samuel." That is when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I glanced at the rearview mirror, angling it to see my passenger. I could see myself reflected there, and the empty road behind us lit by my taillights. But where Samuel should have been, there was nothing. The passenger seat appeared empty in the reflection. I jerked my head to the right to look at him directly, and he was still there, solid and real, water still dripping from his clothes. But in the mirror, the seat was vacant. My heart started pounding, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I wanted to pull over and demand that he get out, but I was terrified of what might happen if I did. So I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. "You need to be careful," Samuel said, suddenly breaking the tense silence. "The curve ahead. People die there. They do not see it coming until it is too late." "What curve?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You will know it when you see it," he replied. "I have seen it so many times. I have tried to warn them, but they never listen, they never stop." "Warn who?" I demanded, my fear giving way to a desperate need for answers. "What are you talking about?" But he did not answer. Instead, he started describing an accident in vivid, horrifying detail. He talked about twisted metal and shattered glass, about the sound of an engine dying and the smell of gasoline. He described the sensation of impact, the way time seemed to slow down in those final moments before everything went dark. As he spoke, the temperature in the car continued to drop, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The radio, which had been silent for hours, suddenly crackled to life, but instead of music or a talk show, it just scanned through stations on its own, creating a dissonant symphony of static and fragments of voices. I did not touch the dial. It was moving by itself. "How do you know my name?" I asked, remembering that he had called me by name earlier, even though I had never introduced myself. "I know a lot of things," he said quietly. "I know you are going to see your parents. I know you are scared right now. And I know that if you do not slow down when you reach the curve, you are going to die." That was it. I could not take it anymore. I started to pull over, intending to demand that he get out of my car, consequences be damned. But before I could even touch the brake, I saw it. Up ahead, illuminated by my headlights, was a sharp curve in the road. There was a warning sign, faded and partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, indicating a dangerous turn ahead. And just beyond the curve, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly as I slowed down. As I approached the scene, I could make out more details. There had been an accident. A car had gone off the road and down an embankment. Emergency responders were everywhere, and I could see a vehicle being pulled up by a tow truck, its front end completely mangled. My mind was reeling. I looked over at Samuel to ask him how he knew about this, but the passenger seat was empty. He was gone. I had not heard the door open. I had not felt the rush of cold air that would have accompanied his exit. He had simply vanished. I pulled over to the side of the road, my entire body shaking. I checked the door locks. They were still engaged, locked from the inside. There was no way he could have opened the door without me hearing it. But he was gone, and the only evidence that he had ever been there was the damp spot on the passenger seat where he had been sitting. A police officer walked up to my window and tapped on it. I rolled it down, and he leaned in slightly, his flashlight briefly blinding me. "You okay?" he asked. "You look pretty shaken up." Yeah, I stammered. "What happened here?" "Bad accident," he said grimly. "Driver came around that curve too fast, lost control, and went over the side. It happened about 15 minutes ago. Did you see anything? Another vehicle, maybe?" "No," I said, my mind struggling to process what was happening. "But I picked up a hitchhiker a few miles back. He warned me about this curve. He described an accident before we even got here." The officer's expression changed. He stood up straighter and his hand moved instinctively toward his belt. "Can you describe this person?" I gave him a detailed description of Samuel, middle-aged, maybe 50s, wearing a button-down shirt and jeans, soaking wet despite the dry weather. As I spoke, the color drained from the officer's face. "Wait here," he said, and walked back to his patrol car. He returned a few minutes later with a photograph, holding it up for me to see. "Is this the man you picked up?" I looked at the photo, and my stomach dropped. It was him. Same face, same haunted eyes, same clothing. "Yes," I whispered. "That is him." "Who is he?" The officer let out a long breath and looked back at the accident scene. "That is the driver who just crashed. He was alone in the vehicle when he went over. He died on impact." I felt like the world had tilted on its axis. "That is impossible," I said. "He was in my car. He talked to me. He warned me about the curve." "You are not the first person to report this," the officer said quietly. "We get calls every few months. Other drivers claim they picked up a hitchhiker on this stretch of road matching that description. He warns them about the curve and then he disappears. Some people think it is his way of trying to save others from the same fate he suffered." "But he just died," I protested. "How could I have picked him up before the accident happened?" The officer shook his head. "The accident happened 15 minutes ago, but people have been reporting sightings of this hitchhiker for the past 3 years, ever since the first time he crashed on this curve. He survived that one, but he was never the same. Started walking this stretch of highway, trying to warn people. Then one night he was walking along the shoulder and someone hit him. Killed him instantly. That was 2 years ago. But the sightings did not stop. If anything, they increased." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what I was being told. The officer gave me his card and told me to call if I remembered anything else. Then he walked back to the accident scene, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I did not continue driving that night. I found a motel about 10 miles down the road and checked in, even though I knew I would not be able to sleep. I spent the entire night researching the area, looking for any information I could find about accidents on that stretch of highway. What I discovered chilled me to my core. That curve had a long history of fatal accidents. Over the past decade, more than 20 people had died there. And in the comments section of one news article about the dangers of the road, I found dozens of accounts from other drivers who claimed they had encountered the same hitchhiker. They all described the same experience. The wet clothes, the warnings about the curve, the sudden disappearance. Some of them, like me, had been driving at the exact moment another accident was occurring. Others had picked him up on quiet nights when nothing was happening. But all of them had been warned to slow down. I believe Samuel, whoever or whatever he was, saved my life that night. If he had not been in my car, if he had not warned me about the curve, I would have taken it at full speed. The road was dark, The warning sign was barely visible, and I was tired from hours of driving. I would have ended up just like the driver whose accident I witnessed, just another statistic on a dangerous stretch of highway. I eventually made it to my parents' house, but I took a different route, adding several hours to my trip to avoid that highway entirely. When I told my family what had happened, they looked at me with a mixture of concern and skepticism. My father suggested I had been hallucinating from exhaustion. My mother thought maybe I had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed the entire encounter. But I know what I experienced. I know Samuel was real, or at least real enough to warn me, real enough to save my life. I still have the officer's card, and I still have the damp stain on my passenger seat that never quite dried properly, no matter how much I tried to clean it. I have driven cross-country several times since then, but I have never gone back to that stretch of Highway 200 in Montana. And I have never picked up another hitchhiker, no matter how desperate they might seem. Because I learned something that night that I will never forget. The world is far stranger and more mysterious than I ever imagined. There are things out there that defy explanation, things that exist in the space between life and death, between the physical world and whatever comes next. And sometimes, just sometimes, those things are trying to help us. Samuel did not have to warn me. He could have let me speed around that curve and meet the same fate he did. But he chose to intervene, to use whatever remnant of himself still lingered on that lonely highway to save a stranger. I still do not know if ghosts are real, but I know what I experienced that night. I know Samuel was in my car. I know he warned me. And I know that if it were not for him, I would not be here to tell this story. So if you ever find yourself driving through Montana late at night, and you see a figure standing on the side of the road with his thumb out asking for a ride, maybe you should stop. Maybe he is trying to save your life too. Or maybe, like me, you will learn that some debts can never be repaid, and some guardian angels come in the most unexpected forms. I still cannot drive past certain motels without feeling my stomach drop. What happened to me 3 years ago changed how I see the world, how I see other people, and how I think about the random decisions we make that end up determining whether we live or die. I was 26 at the time, working as a freelance photographer, and I had decided to take a solo road trip along Route 66 to document the old Americana aesthetic for a portfolio project. I had this romantic vision of vintage diners, abandoned gas stations, and quirky roadside attractions bathed in golden hour light. What I got instead was a front row seat to something that still haunts my nightmares. I had been on the road for about a week, making my way from Chicago toward California, stopping whenever something caught my eye and posting my favorite shots to Instagram. My followers loved the content, and I was feeling pretty good about the whole adventure. But on the 8th day, everything went wrong. I had spent too long photographing an abandoned drive-in theater outside of a tiny Oklahoma town, and by the time I realized how late it had gotten, the sun was already setting. I pulled out my phone to find the nearest hotel, but my service was spotty at best. My GPS kept losing signal, and when it finally loaded, the closest chain hotel was over 2 hours away. I did not want to drive that far in the dark on unfamiliar roads, so I started looking for alternatives. That was when I saw it. A small, run-down motel just off the highway, the kind of place that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1970s. The neon sign out front flickered weakly. Half the letters burned out, reading Va NY instead of vacancy. Every instinct I had told me to keep driving, but I was exhausted, and the thought of being back on the road for another 2 hours made the decision for me. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, which was almost completely empty except for 2 other vehicles, a beat-up pickup truck and a sedan with out-of-state plates. The front office smelled like cigarette smoke and mildew. The man behind the counter looked like he had not slept in days, His eyes were bloodshot, and he barely glanced at me when I walked in. I asked for a room, and he slid a registration card across the counter without a word. I filled it out, paid in cash because the credit card machine was broken, and he handed me a physical key attached to a large plastic tag with the room number stamped on it. Room 12. As I walked to my room, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The motel was shaped like an L, with all the rooms facing the parking lot. The doors were painted a faded turquoise, and most of the windows had their curtains drawn. I found room 12 at the far end of the building, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. The room was exactly what I expected: outdated furniture, a musty smell, and questionable stains on the carpet. But it had a bed, and that was all I needed. I dropped my camera bag on the dresser and collapsed onto the bed, scrolling through my phone to see if I had enough signal to let my friends know where I was. That was when I heard it. Raised voices coming from the room next to mine. At first, I tried to ignore it, figuring it was just a couple having an argument. But the voices grew louder, more aggressive. A man was shouting, his words muffled but filled with rage. A woman was screaming back, her voice shrill and desperate. Then I heard something crash, like furniture being thrown. I sat up, my heart starting to race. I have always been the kind of person who minds my own business, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. I grabbed my phone, debating whether to call the front desk or just ignore it and hope it would stop on its own. The arguing continued for another few minutes, escalating to the point where I could hear every word through the paper-thin walls. The man was accusing the woman of something, though I could not make out exactly what. The woman was crying now, begging him to calm down. And then suddenly there was silence. The abrupt quiet was somehow worse than the shouting. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to hear anything. For a long moment there was nothing. Then I heard a new sound. A heavy, dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor. My mind immediately went to the worst-case scenario, and I felt a wave of panic wash over me. I moved to the window and carefully pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The parking lot was dimly lit by a single overhead light, and I had a clear view of the room next to mine. The door was closed, but I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Then the door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He looked around the parking lot, his movements deliberate and cautious, like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. Then he walked to the sedan I had seen earlier and popped the trunk. I watched, frozen, as he went back into the room and emerged a moment later dragging something wrapped in a blanket. It was large and heavy, and the shape of it made my blood run cold. He lifted it with effort and placed it in the trunk, then slammed it shut and wiped his hands on his jeans. That was when he looked up, directly at my window. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I jerked back, letting the curtain fall closed. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I fumbled for my phone and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered as quietly as I could, explaining what I had seen. She asked for my location, and I gave her the name of the motel and the room number. She told me to stay on the line, that officers were being dispatched and would arrive as soon as possible. But she also said it would take at least 30 minutes because the motel was in a remote area. 30 minutes. I did not know if I had 30 minutes. I heard footsteps outside my door, heavy and deliberate. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, measured knocks that sent a jolt of terror through my entire body. "Hey," a man's voice called out. "You in there? I saw you looking out the window." I did not answer. I pressed my back against the wall next to the door, clutching my phone like it was a lifeline. The dispatcher was still on the line, telling me to stay calm. That help was on the way. The knocking came again, harder this time. "I know you are in there. Open the door. We need to talk." I looked around the room for anything I could use as a weapon. The only thing I had was a small canister of pepper spray in my purse. I grabbed it and moved into the bathroom, locking the door behind me. It was a flimsy lock, the kind that could be kicked in easily, but it was better than nothing. The knocking stopped, and for a moment I thought maybe he had given up. Then I heard the sound of my room door being forced open. The cheap lock gave way almost immediately, and I heard him step inside. I could hear him moving through the room, opening the closet, checking behind the furniture. He was searching for me. "Come on," he said, his voice unnervingly calm now. "I just want to talk. You did not see anything. You do not know what you think you saw." I crouched in the bathtub, holding the pepper spray in front of me, my finger on the trigger. The bathroom door was the only thing between us, and I knew it would not hold if he decided to break it down. I could hear him getting closer, his footsteps stopping just outside the bathroom. The doorknob rattled as he tested it. That was when I heard the most beautiful sound I have ever heard in my life. Sirens. Faint at first, but growing louder. The man heard them too. He cursed under his breath, and I heard him run out of my room. I stayed in the bathtub, too terrified to move, until I heard car doors slamming and voices shouting police commands. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the bathroom door, but this time it was followed by a calm, authoritative voice. "Ma'am, this is the police. You are safe now. You can come out." I unlocked the door with trembling hands and stepped out to find 2 officers standing in my room. One of them was a woman, and she immediately put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me outside. The parking lot was now filled with police cars, their lights flashing red and blue. I saw the man from the next room in handcuffs being pushed into the back of a patrol car. Other officers were examining the sedan, and I watched as they opened the trunk. What they found confirmed my worst fears. There was a woman inside, bound and unconscious but alive. The paramedics arrived shortly after and loaded her into an ambulance. One of the officers came over to take my statement, and I told him everything I had seen and heard. He explained that the man had kidnapped the woman 2 days earlier, from a town about 100 miles away. He had been moving her to a secondary location when they stopped at the motel for the night. If I had not called when I did, if I had not been paying attention, she likely would have been killed. The officer also told me something that made my skin crawl. The motel manager had been questioned, and it turned out he had a history of looking the other way when suspicious activity occurred on his property. There were other cases, other disappearances that investigators were now linking to the motel. It had been a stopover point for criminals traveling along that stretch of Route 66, a place where they knew they could operate without anyone asking questions. I gave my statement, provided my contact information, and was told I would likely need to testify if the case went to trial. The police arranged for me to stay at a different hotel that night, one that was actually safe. I did not sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's face staring up at my window, or I heard the sound of him forcing open my door. In the weeks and months that followed, I learned more about the case. The woman I had helped save was named Aria, and her family reached out to me to express their gratitude. We eventually met in person, and she told me about her ordeal, about how she had been taken from a grocery store parking lot and had spent 2 days not knowing if she would live or die. She said that hearing the police sirens that night was the moment she knew she was going to survive. The man was eventually convicted on multiple charges, including kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. I did testify at the trial, and it was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Sitting in that courtroom, recounting what I had witnessed, looking at the man who had tried to get into my room, it brought back all the fear and helplessness I had felt that night. It has been 3 years now, and I still struggle with the aftermath. I cannot do solo road trips anymore. The thought of being alone in an unfamiliar place, of not knowing who might be in the room next to me, fills me with anxiety. I only stay at well-reviewed chain hotels now, and even then I check the locks multiple times before I can relax. I see a therapist regularly, and she has helped me work through a lot of the trauma, but some things never fully go away. People tell me I am a hero, that I saved a life, and I guess in a way I did. But I do not feel like a hero. I feel like someone who got lucky, someone who happened to look out a window at the exact right moment and made the decision to act instead of turning away. I think about what would have happened if I had not been there, or if I had been too scared to call the police, or if I had convinced myself that it was not my business. Arya would be dead, and that man would still be out there. I got lucky that night. If I had not looked out that window, if I had not called when I did, if the police had taken just a few minutes longer to arrive, things could have gone very differently. The man could have forced his way into the bathroom. He could have hurt me, but instead I survived, and so did Arya. And now I carry that experience with me everywhere I go. I cannot drive past a motel without wondering who is inside, what might be happening behind those closed doors. I cannot unhear the sounds from that night, the arguing, the dragging, the knocking on my door. Every road trip reminds me how close she came to dying and how close I came to being another victim. I need to tell someone about this because I still cannot make sense of it. Last October, I got stuck in what I can only describe as a loop, and no matter how many times I try to rationalize what happened, I cannot find an explanation that makes any logical sense. I have always considered myself a practical person, someone who trusts maps and GPS and the laws of physics. But what happened to me on that back road in rural Colorado broke every rule I thought I understood about how the world works. I had been visiting my brother in Denver for the weekend, and I was driving back home to Albuquerque on a Sunday afternoon. The drive usually takes about 7 hours, and I have done it dozens of times, so I know the route well. About halfway through, traffic on the main highway came to a complete standstill because of an accident. I sat there for 20 minutes watching the line of cars stretch endlessly in both directions before I decided to take a detour. I pulled up Google Maps and found a back road that would cut through some rural areas and eventually reconnect with the highway about 50 miles down. I have always been confident in my navigation skills, and I actually prefer taking back roads when I can. They are more scenic, less stressful than highway driving, and you never know what interesting small towns you might discover. So I exited at the next off-ramp and followed the GPS directions onto a 2-lane country road that wound through farmland and scattered patches of forest. The weather was clear and it was late afternoon, so I had plenty of daylight left. Everything seemed normal for the first 15 or 20 minutes. Then I passed a distinctive landmark that caught my attention. An old abandoned barn painted deep red with graffiti spray painted across the side that read, "The end is near," in jagged white letters. I remember thinking it was ominous, but in that kitschy, rural America kind of way. I even considered stopping to take a photo, but I wanted to get home before dark, so I kept driving. I continued down the road for another 20 minutes, following the curves and gentle hills of the landscape. Then I saw it again. The same red barn, the same graffiti, in the exact same position relative to the road. At first, I thought maybe there were 2 similar barns in the area. It is rural Colorado, after all. But as I got closer, I could see that it was not just similar, it was identical. Same broken boards in the same places, same rust pattern on the metal roof, same everything. I felt a flicker of confusion, but told myself I must have somehow gotten turned around. Maybe I had missed a turn, or maybe the GPS had glitched and rerouted me without me noticing. I pulled over and checked my phone. According to the map, I was exactly where I should be, moving steadily along the detour route. There was no indication that I had turned around or deviated from the path. I took a deep breath, put the car back in drive, and continued. Forward, paying closer attention this time to the road and my surroundings. I made a mental note of every turn, every landmark, making sure I was following the GPS directions exactly. 20 minutes later, I passed the barn again. This time, the confusion turned to panic. I slammed on the brakes and sat there in the middle of the road, staring at the barn through my windshield. This was not possible. I had been driving in a straight line following the GPS, and somehow I had ended up back at the same point. I checked the map again. It still showed me on the correct route, the blue dot representing my car steadily moving forward. But clearly something was very wrong. I decided to run a test. I got out of the car, walked over to the side of the road near the barn, and took off my jacket. I tied it to a fence post so that it would be visible from the road. Then I got back in the car and started driving again, this time keeping my eyes locked on the odometer. I drove for exactly 30 minutes, covering about 25 miles according to the car's display. Then I saw the barn again. And there, tied to the fence post, was my jacket. My hands started shaking on the steering wheel. This was not a navigation error. This was something else entirely. I was somehow driving in a loop, returning to the same physical location over and over again, even though my car was clearly moving forward and accumulating miles. I looked at the sky. The sun should have been setting by now, but it was frozen in the same position it had been an hour ago, stuck in that perpetual late afternoon angle. I checked my gas gauge, expecting it to be much lower after all the driving I had been doing. But it showed 3/4 full, exactly the same level it had been when I first took the detour. None of this made any sense. I was accumulating miles on my odometer but not using any gas. I was driving for what felt like hours, but the sun was not moving. And no matter which direction I drove, I always ended up back at the same barn. I tried everything I could think of. I turned around and drove in the opposite direction. I took every side road and turnoff I could find. I even tried driving off-road for a bit, bouncing across a field, but it always led me back to the same stretch of pavement, the same barn, the same fence post with my jacket tied to it. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs of any other human beings. Just me, the road, and the barn. The isolation was starting to get to me. I have never experienced such profound loneliness, such a complete sense of being separated from the rest of reality. I tried calling my brother, but my phone had no signal. I tried the radio, but every station was just static, or occasionally it would cut in with fragments of sound that I slowly realized were my own voice from a few minutes earlier, like the radio was somehow playing back things I had said inside the car. I started to wonder if I was dead. Maybe I had been in an accident and did not remember it. Maybe this was some kind of purgatory, a punishment or a test. Or maybe I was in a coma somewhere and this was all a dream. I even considered more outlandish possibilities. Parallel dimensions, alien abduction, some kind of glitch in the fabric of reality itself. After what felt like hours, but might have been minutes or days, I could not tell anymore. I stopped the car and got out. I walked toward the barn, determined to investigate it more closely. Maybe there was something inside that would explain what was happening, but as I approached, I noticed something I had not seen before. The barn was not exactly identical each time I passed it. There were subtle differences. The graffiti was slightly different in each iteration, the letters arranged in a different order or written in a different style. Some versions had broken windows that were intact in others. It was like I was seeing variations of the same structure, as if I was not returning to the same barn, but instead passing through slightly different versions of it. That was when I saw the headlights. In the distance, cutting through the strange twilight, another car was approaching. I felt a surge of relief so intense it nearly brought me to my knees. I was not alone. I ran to the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically to flag down the vehicle. The car slowed and stopped about 20 feet away from me. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. She looked calm, almost eerily so, considering the circumstances. She was maybe in her 50s, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, and she looked at me with an expression that suggested she had been expecting to find me here. "You are stuck," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I gasped. "I keep driving, but I end up back at the same place. I do not understand what is happening." "You have to break the pattern," she said simply. "You are caught in a loop, and the only way out is to do something completely different from what you have been doing." "What do you mean?" I asked, desperate for any guidance. "Close your eyes and drive straight without looking for exactly 10 minutes. Do not open them, no matter what you hear or feel. Break the pattern, and you will break the loop." I wanted to ask her who she was, how she knew about this, whether she had experienced it herself. But when I blinked, she was gone. The car was gone. I was standing alone in the middle of the road again, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the entire encounter. But her words echoed in my mind. Break the pattern. I got back in my car, gripped the steering wheel and closed my eyes. Then I pressed down on the accelerator. Every instinct I had screamed at me to open my eyes to see where I was going, but I forced myself to keep them shut. I counted the seconds in my head, trying to keep track of how much time had passed. The car drifted slightly, and I corrected it by feel, keeping the wheel as straight as I could. After what I estimated was 10 minutes, I opened my eyes. I was no longer on the back road. I was on a completely different highway, one I recognized. It was State Road 285, a main route that I had driven many times before. I was about 40 miles from Albuquerque, near my home. I pulled over to the side of the road and checked my phone. It showed that 8 hours had passed since I had taken the detour. 8 hours. But it had felt like both an eternity and only a few minutes at the same time. I tried to retrace my route to find that back road again, but I never could. I have driven through that area dozens of times since then, looking for the turnoff, looking for the red barn with the graffiti. It does not exist, not on any map, not on any GPS, not in physical reality as far as I can tell. I have searched online forums and found a few scattered reports from other drivers describing similar experiences. They call them phantom roads or ghost highways, stretches of pavement that appear and disappear, trapping travelers in impossible loops. I still do not know what happened to me that day. I do not know if it was some kind of dimensional anomaly, a psychological break, or something else entirely. All I know is that I was trapped, and I should not have gotten out. But I did, thanks to a mysterious woman who may or may not have been real. Now I only take main highways. I refuse to take shortcuts or detours, even if it means sitting in traffic for hours, because I learned that some roads do not lead anywhere and some places exist outside the normal rules of time and space. And if you are unlucky enough to find yourself on one of those roads, you might never find your way home. If you are ever on a road trip and you get a bad feeling about a rest stop, trust your gut. I did not, and something came home with us. I am not talking about bedbugs or a stomach virus. I am talking about something that should not exist, something that attached itself to us and nearly destroyed my relationship and my sanity in the process. This happened 2 years ago, but I still have nightmares about it, and I still refuse to use rest stops, especially the isolated ones in the middle of nowhere. My boyfriend Owen and I were driving through rural Texas, making our way from Austin to El Paso to visit his family for Thanksgiving. It was a long drive, about 9 hours, and we had left late in the afternoon, which meant we would be driving through the night. Around midnight, we were somewhere between Ozona and Fort Stockton on Interstate 10, and we both needed to use the restroom. We had been passing rest stops every 50 miles or so, but Owen kept insisting he could wait until the next one, and I went along with it because I did not desperately need to stop yet either. Then we saw the sign for a rest area coming up in 2 miles. The sign was old and faded, barely illuminated by our headlights, but it was there. Owen finally agreed that we should stop. As we pulled off the highway and into the rest area, I felt an immediate sense of wrongness. The place was completely deserted. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which was not that unusual for midnight on a weekday, but something about the emptiness felt intentional, like the place had been abandoned. The overhead lights were flickering in that horror movie way, buzzing loudly and casting unstable shadows across the pavement. The building itself looked run down, with peeling paint and dark windows. There was no attendant booth, no vending machines humming with life. Just silence broken only by the sound of our car engine ticking as it cooled. "I do not like this place," I said to Owen. "Can we just wait until the next stop?" "We are already here," he replied, unbuckling his seatbelt. "It will take 2 minutes, come on." I reluctantly got out of the car and we walked toward the restroom facilities. The men's and women's rooms were in separate buildings connected by a covered walkway. The whole area smelled like stagnant water and something else I could not quite identify, something organic and rotten. I hurried into the women's restroom, which was just as decrepit as I expected. Graffiti covered the walls and the lights inside were even worse than the ones in the parking lot, flickering so badly that I had to use my phone flashlight to see properly. As I was washing my hands, I glanced up at the mirror above the sink. For just a fraction of a second, I saw something that made my heart stop. Standing behind me in the reflection was a dark figure, tall and impossibly thin, with no discernible features. But when I spun around, there was nothing there. The restroom was empty. I told myself it was just the flickering lights playing tricks on my eyes, or maybe exhaustion from the long drive. But my hands were shaking as I dried them and rushed out of the building. Owen was already back at the car, leaning against the driver's side door. "Took you long enough," he said, but there was something off about his tone. It was not quite irritable, but it was not quite normal either. I brushed it off and got in the passenger seat. As we pulled out of the rest area and back onto the highway, I looked back at the building in the side mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, illuminated by the flickering lights, watching us leave. About 20 minutes down the road, things started getting strange. The radio, which had been playing country music, suddenly switched to static. Owen reached over to adjust it, and it scanned through stations on its own, settling on pure white noise. He turned it off, but a few seconds later it turned back on, still blaring static. "What the hell?" Owen muttered, smacking the dashboard. The radio finally went silent, but then the temperature in the car started fluctuating wildly. One moment it was warm, the next it was freezing cold, cold enough that I could see my breath misting in the air. I adjusted the climate control, but nothing changed. Then I felt it, a pressure on my right shoulder, like someone had placed a heavy hand there. I jerked away from it, looking over my shoulder, but the back seat was empty. "Did you feel that?" I asked Owen. "Feel what?" he snapped. His tone was harsh, aggressive in a way that was completely unlike him. Owen was usually calm and patient, but now he seemed irritable, almost hostile. "Never mind," I said quietly, unsettled by his reaction. I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. In the reflection, I could see something in the back seat. It was shadowy and indistinct, like smoke given a vague human shape. But it was there. I whipped around to look directly at the back seat, and it was empty. But when I looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, sitting directly behind Owen. "Owen, there is something in the car," I said, my voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" he said. But his voice sounded different now, deeper and strange. "You are being paranoid. Just go to sleep." I did not go to sleep. I could not. The atmosphere in the car had become oppressive and suffocating. Owen's behavior was getting worse. He started muttering under his breath, words I could not quite make out. At one point he laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent chills down my spine. This was not the man I knew. Something was wrong with him, or something was influencing him. By the time we reached a small town with a motel, it was almost 3 in the morning. I insisted we stop, and Owen did not argue. We checked into a room, and I hoped that maybe getting out of the car would help, that whatever was happening would dissipate. But it only got worse. In the motel room, objects started moving on their own. The bathroom door would open by itself. The television turned on and off without anyone touching the remote. And Owen's personality continued to deteriorate. He became hostile and aggressive, saying things that were cruel and completely out of character. At one point, he looked at me with eyes that seemed darker than they should be, and he said in a voice that was not entirely his, "You should not have stopped there. You let me in." That was when I realized that whatever had been at that rest stop had attached itself to us, or more specifically, to Owen. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my friend Evelyn, who had always been interested in the paranormal. I explained what was happening, my words tumbling out in a frantic whisper. She took me seriously immediately. "You need to perform a cleansing," she said. "Do you have salt?" I checked the motel bathroom and found those little salt packets they give you with room service. It would have to do. Evelyn walked me through a makeshift protection ritual. I created a salt line at the bathroom threshold and demanded out loud that whatever entity had attached itself to Owen leave immediately. I told it that it was not welcome, that it had no right to be there, and that it needed to go back to wherever it came from. From the other room, I heard crashing sounds, furniture being overturned, and Owen's voice screaming in rage. Then suddenly silence. I waited, my heart pounding, clutching the phone. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. I cautiously opened the bathroom door. Owen was collapsed on the floor beside the bed, unconscious but breathing. The oppressive feeling that had saturated the room was gone. The air felt lighter, cleaner. I knelt beside him and gently shook his shoulder. His eyes opened, and they were his eyes again, clear and confused. "What happened?" he asked groggily. "Why am I on the floor?" He had no memory of the past few hours. He did not remember his aggressive behavior, the things he had said, or the way he had acted. To him, we had stopped at the rest area, gotten back in the car, and the next thing he knew, he was waking up on the motel room floor. I told him everything, and at first he did not believe me. But when he saw the overturned furniture and the salt line I had created, when he felt the scratches on his arms that he could not explain, he started to take it seriously. We left the motel as soon as the sun came up and drove straight to El Paso without stopping. We did not talk much during the drive. Owen was processing what I had told him, trying to reconcile it with his understanding of reality. When we finally arrived at his parents' house, I asked him to have the car blessed or cleansed, and he agreed. We found a local priest who performed a blessing, and I had my own house cleansed when I returned home. For weeks afterward, both of us experienced nightmares. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the sensation of being watched, or I would see shadows moving in my peripheral vision. Owen admitted he felt the same way. We both started seeing therapists to help us process the trauma. Eventually, the nightmares faded, and the sensation of being followed diminished, but it never entirely went away. I later researched that rest stop and found scattered reports online from other travelers. Several people described feeling uneasy there, and a few reported experiencing similar phenomena after stopping. Electronic malfunctions, personality changes, and the sense of something following them. One forum post mentioned that the rest area had been built on land that had once been used for darker purposes, though the details were vague and unverified. Another claimed that a series of deaths had occurred in the area over the years, though I could not find any official records to confirm it. Whatever was at that rest stop, it was not human, and it was not friendly. It found a weakness in Owen, or maybe it just found an opportunity and it attached itself to him. If Evelyn had not talked me through that cleansing, I do not know what would have happened. Owen might have been lost to whatever that thing was, or worse, he might have hurt me or himself. I refuse to use rest stops anymore, especially the isolated ones. If I am on a road trip and need to stop, I find a gas station or a restaurant somewhere with lights and people. Because I learned that some places are wrong, fundamentally wrong, and they attract things that should not exist. And once those things find you, they do not let go easily. Whatever was at that rest stop wanted to come home with us, and we barely managed to force it to leave. I will never take that risk again. My 3 buddies and I have a pact that we do not talk about our road trip from 2021. But I need to tell this story because we all saw it happen, and pretending it did not happen is not making it go away. 4 of us witnessed something that should not be possible, and it has changed how all of us see the world. What happened out there in the Nevada desert that night broke the rules of reality, and none of us have been the same since. Every year since college, my friends and I take a guy's road trip. It is our way of staying connected, even though we all live in different cities now. In 2021, we decided to drive from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, taking the scenic route through Nevada. There were 4 of us, me, my friend Carter and his passenger, and 2 other guys in my vehicle. We drove convoy style, keeping our 2 vehicles within sight of each other and using walkie-talkies to communicate because cell service is basically non-existent in that part of the country. We left late in the afternoon, planning to drive through the night and arrive in Salt Lake City by morning. The first few hours were uneventful. Just miles and miles of empty desert highway stretching out under a massive sky. There is something both beautiful and unsettling about the Nevada desert at night. The darkness is so complete that it feels like you are driving through space, and the stars are so bright they almost look unreal. It was around midnight when we spotted the convoy. We were on Highway 50, which people call the loneliest road in America, and we had not seen another vehicle for at least an hour. Then in the distance, we saw lights. As we got closer, we realized it was a convoy of semi-trucks, maybe 5 or 6 of them, all driving in perfect formation. They were spaced evenly apart, moving at exactly the same speed, like they were all being controlled by the same driver. What struck me immediately was how identical they were. Same model, same color, same everything. But there were no company logos, no markings of any kind, just plain white trailers reflecting our headlights. I clicked on my walkie-talkie. "You guys seeing this?" I asked Carter. "Yeah," his voice crackled back. "That is weird, right? No branding on any of them." We decided to pass the convoy. I pulled into the left lane and started accelerating. As I came up alongside the first truck, I tried to look into the cab to see the driver, but the windows were dark, tinted so heavily that I could not see anything inside. I passed the first truck and moved on to the second, then the third. Each one was the same. Identical trucks with blacked-out windows driving in perfect synchronization. Carter's vehicle was following behind me, and I watched in my rearview mirror as he pulled out to pass as well. He cleared the first truck and moved up alongside the second. That is when everything went wrong. One moment, Carter's vehicle was there, visible in my mirror. The next moment, it was gone. Just vanished, like someone had erased it from existence. I slammed on my brakes and grabbed the walkie-talkie. "Carter? Carter, where are you?" Static. Then faintly his voice came through, distorted and stretched like a recording being played at the wrong speed. Joseph, where are we? What do you mean, where are you? I shouted into the walkie. We are not on the highway anymore, he said, his voice thick with confusion and fear. The road looks different. Everything looks different. I pulled over onto the shoulder and jumped out of the car. My passenger did the same, and we stood there staring at the convoy as it continued past us. There was no sign of Carter's vehicle anywhere. It had simply disappeared. The remaining trucks rolled by in their eerie formation, and I tried to look inside them again, tried to see any indication of what had just happened. But the windows remained impenetrably dark. "This is not possible," my passenger said, his voice shaking. "Where did they go?" I clicked the walkie-talkie again. "Carter, can you hear me? What do you see?" More static, then his voice returned. "The sky is wrong. It is not the right color, and there are signs, but I cannot read them. The symbols do not make any sense." "Symbols? What symbols?" I asked, but before he could answer, the connection went dead. Just static. I tried calling his cell phone, but there was no signal. We waited there on the side of the road, watching the convoy disappear into the distance. 10 minutes passed. 15. I was seriously considering calling the highway patrol, except I had no signal and no idea what I would even tell them. Then the walkie-talkie crackled to life again. "Joseph?" It was Carter's voice, clearer now but still shaken. "We are back. We are on the highway behind you." I spun around and saw headlights approaching from behind. It was Carter's vehicle driving toward us as if nothing had happened. He pulled over onto the shoulder and both he and his passenger got out. They looked pale and disoriented, like they had just woken up from a nightmare. "What the hell just happened?" I demanded. "You disappeared. Where did you go?" Carter ran his hands through his hair, his movements jerky and anxious. "I do not know. One second we were passing the trucks, and the next second we were on a completely different road. It did not look like anywhere I have ever been. The asphalt was the wrong color, kind of purplish, and the road signs were covered in symbols I did not recognize. And the sky," he trailed off, struggling to find words. "The sky was orange, not like a sunset, but solid orange, like someone had painted it." His passenger nodded frantically. "It is true. I saw it too. We drove for maybe a minute, maybe less, and then suddenly we were back on the normal highway. But it felt longer, like we had been gone for hours." I checked my watch and then compared it to Carter's phone. According to my watch, they had been missing for about 10 minutes. But according to Carter's phone, 2 hours had passed. The timestamp showed it was 2:15 in the morning for him, while my phone showed 12:20. We decided to check the dashcam footage. Carter had a camera mounted on his dashboard that recorded continuously while he drove. We pulled up the footage on his phone and watched. It showed them driving normally, passing the first truck in the convoy. Then as they pulled alongside the second truck, the footage glitched. The image distorted, broke apart into pixels, and then reformed, showing something that made no sense. The footage showed them driving on a road that was definitely not Highway 50. The landscape was alien, the colors all wrong. The purple road stretched ahead, and in the distance there were structures that looked like buildings but were shaped in geometrically impossible ways. The orange sky cast everything in a sickly light. The footage continued for about 30 seconds, showing them driving through this impossible place. And then it glitched again. When the image stabilized, they were back on the normal highway. None of us said much after that. We got back in our vehicles and continued driving, but the convoy was gone. There were no exits or side roads where they could have turned off. They had simply vanished, just like Carter's vehicle had vanished, except they had not come back. We drove straight through to Salt Lake City without stopping, all of us too unsettled to do anything else. The next day, we tried to make sense of what had happened. We researched phantom convoys and found several reports from other drivers who claimed to have seen similar things. Unmarked trucks driving in perfect formation, appearing and disappearing on remote highways, particularly in the American Southwest. Some people theorized they were military vehicles. Others thought they were alien in nature. No one had any real answers. The four of us tried to go to the authorities, but when we explained what had happened, we were essentially told we were confused or mistaken. The officer we spoke to suggested we had been tired and had maybe fallen asleep at the wheel without realizing it. But we had footage. We had evidence. And it did not matter because what we experienced was so far outside the realm of normal experience that no one wanted to acknowledge it. Carter has never been the same since that night. He developed severe anxiety about driving, especially at night. He refuses to drive anywhere near that stretch of highway. His passenger moved to a different state shortly after and cut off contact with all of us, like he wanted to erase the entire experience from his life. My other friend became obsessed with researching unexplained phenomena, spending hours online in forums and chat rooms with other people who claimed to have experienced similar things. As for me, I still have nightmares. I dream about that convoy, about those identical white trucks with their blacked-out windows. I dream about pulling alongside one and finally seeing what is inside, and in those dreams what I see is so terrible that I wake up gasping for air, unable to remember the details but left with a profound sense of dread. We made a pact not to discuss it because people think we are crazy, but Carter and his passenger were gone. They went somewhere that was not supposed to exist. They drove on a road that was not on any map, under a sky that was the wrong color, past signs covered in symbols that no human wrote. And then they came back, but not all the way. Part of them is still there, still driving on that impossible road, still trying to find their way home. I do not know what those trucks were. I do not know where they went or where they took my friends, even if only for a few minutes. All I know is that there are places in this world, or maybe places that exist alongside this world, that we are not meant to see. And if you are unlucky enough to catch a glimpse of them, if you accidentally cross over into those spaces, you might not make it back. Or if you do make it back, you will never be whole again. I have been in therapy for 2 years because of what I discovered during a cross-country move. The police told me I did the right thing, but I still have nightmares. I still see her hands pressed against the crack in that trunk, trying desperately to push it open. I still hear the muffled sounds she was making, the terror in those sounds. And I still wonder what would have happened if I had not stopped at that rest area, if I had not noticed. If I had just kept driving and minded my own business like so many people do. This happened in the spring of 2023. I was moving from Georgia to California for a new job, and I had decided to drive instead of fly because I wanted to bring my belongings with me and see the country along the way. I rented a moving truck, loaded up everything I owned, and set out on what I thought would be an adventure. For the first 2 days, it was exactly that. I stopped at interesting roadside attractions, took photos, and felt that sense of freedom that comes from being on the open road with no particular schedule to keep. On the 3rd day, I was driving through New Mexico on Interstate 40. Traffic was heavy, and there was a sedan behind me that had been driving aggressively for about 20 miles. The driver was tailgating, swerving between lanes, and generally driving like someone who was either intoxicated or in some kind of crisis. I am normally a pretty patient driver, but this person was making me nervous. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, there they were, right on my bumper, even though I was already going 10 miles over the speed limit. Eventually, I saw a sign for a rest area coming up in 5 miles. I decided to pull off and let the aggressive driver pass. I needed to use the restroom anyway, and I figured it would be better to just get away from them rather than continue to be stressed out by their erratic driving. I put on my turn signal well in advance and moved into the exit lane. The sedan followed me. My stomach tightened with unease. Maybe they needed to stop too. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I pulled into the rest area parking lot, which was moderately busy with families and travelers. The sedan followed me in and parked several spaces away. I watched in my side mirror as the driver got out. He was a man, maybe in his 40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He did not look at me or my truck. He just headed straight for the rest area building, moving quickly, almost running. I got out of my truck, telling myself I was being paranoid. But something felt off. I could not put my finger on exactly what it was, just a general sense that something was wrong with the situation. I started walking toward the restrooms, but as I passed the sedan, I heard something that made me freeze in place. A thumping sound, faint but distinct. It was coming from the trunk. I stopped and looked around. The parking lot was busy enough that there were people around, but no one seemed to be paying attention to the sedan or to me. I moved closer to the vehicle, trying to look casual, like I was just walking past. The thumping came again, more insistent this time. And then I heard something else. A muffled sound like someone trying to scream through a gag. My heart started pounding. I crouched down next to the trunk, pretending to tie my shoe, and that is when I saw it. The trunk was not quite closed. There was a small gap, maybe an inch, where the latch had not caught properly. And through that gap I could see fingers. Human fingers pressed against the opening, trying desperately to push the trunk open from the inside. I stood up so fast I almost fell over. My mind was racing. Someone was in that trunk. Someone was trapped, and they were alive. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and immediately dialed 911. The dispatcher answered, and I whispered frantically into the phone, explaining what I had found. "Ma'am, I need you to stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Where is the driver of the vehicle now?" "He went inside the building," I said, glancing toward the rest area. "I do not know how long he will be in there." "Do not approach the vehicle again," the dispatcher instructed. "Go somewhere visible but at a distance. Officers are being dispatched to your location now." I moved back toward my truck, but I kept my eyes on the sedan. I could still see movement in the trunk area, could see those fingers still pushing against the gap. Whoever was in there knew I was nearby. They were trying to signal me, trying to get free. Then I saw the driver coming out of the building. My blood turned to ice. He was walking back toward the sedan, his movements casual, like he did not have a care in the world. Like he did not have a human being trapped in his trunk. He glanced around the parking lot as he walked, and for just a moment his eyes met mine. Something in his expression changed. He had seen me looking at his car. He knew. He picked up his pace, moving faster now. He was heading straight for the sedan. I realized with horror that he was going to get in and drive away, and whoever was in that trunk would be gone, taken to God knows where to face God knows what fate. The nearest police were still minutes away. I could not let him leave. Without thinking, I started walking toward him. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you dropped something." He stopped and turned to look at me, his expression flat and unreadable. "What?" "Back there," I said, pointing vaguely behind him, away from the car. "I saw something fall out of your pocket." He stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him calculating, trying to decide if I was telling the truth or if I was trying to delay him. Finally, he turned to look where I was pointing. That was when I heard the sirens. The man heard them too. His head snapped toward the sound, and I saw panic flash across his face. He lunged for the sedan, fumbling with his keys. But the police were already pulling into the rest area, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Step away from the vehicle. Put your hands where I can see them." The man froze, his hand still on the car door handle. For a moment I thought he might try to run, but then his shoulders sagged and he slowly raised his hands. Officers swarmed him, pulling him away from the car and forcing him to the ground. One of the officers approached me, asking if I was the person who had called, and I nodded, unable to find my voice. Another officer went to the trunk of the sedan. He called out to the others, and they quickly got the trunk open. I could not see clearly from where I was standing, but I heard the officer's urgent voice calling for paramedics. Moments later, they lifted a woman out of the trunk. She was bound with duct tape, her wrists and ankles tied, a gag in her mouth. Her face was bruised and her eyes were wide with terror and relief. Paramedics arrived and immediately began treating her. I watched from a distance as they removed her restraints, checked her vitals, and loaded her onto a stretcher. She kept looking around like she could not believe she was safe, could not believe it was over. At one point, her eyes found mine, and even from across the parking lot, I could see the gratitude in her expression. The police took my statement. I told them everything I had seen and heard, from the aggressive driving to the sounds from the trunk. The officer told me that the woman, whose name was Scarlett, had been kidnapped 2 days earlier from a grocery store parking lot in Amarillo, Texas. The man who had taken her had a history of violent offenses and was suspected in connection with other disappearances in the region. He had been transporting her to a secondary location when I encountered him at the rest area. "If you had not called when you did," the officer said, "she probably would not have survived the day. You saved her life." I did not feel like a hero. I felt sick. I felt shaken. I kept thinking about how close it had been, how easily I could have ignored my instincts, how I almost kept driving instead of stopping at that rest area. The randomness of it all terrified me. If I had not needed to use the restroom, if that man had not been tailgating me, if the trunk had been fully closed, Scarlett would be dead. The case went to trial months later, and I had to testify. Sitting in that courtroom looking at the man who had done this was one of the hardest things I have ever done. But I did it because Scarlett needed me to. She testified too, describing her ordeal in heartbreaking detail. The jury convicted him on multiple charges, including kidnapping, assault, and attempted murder. He received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Scarlett and I stayed in touch after the trial. Her family reached out to thank me, and eventually Scarlett and I met for coffee. She told me that she had thought she was going to die, that she had been praying for a miracle, and then she heard me walking past the car. She said she pushed against that trunk with everything she had, hoping someone would notice, hoping someone would care enough to investigate. And I did. But even though I saved her, even though she is alive and recovering, I cannot shake the trauma of that day. I have nightmares about it constantly. In my dreams, I walk past the car without stopping. In my dreams, I ignore the sounds. I talk myself out of investigating. I convince myself it is not my problem. And then I see Scarlett's face on the news as a missing person who was never found. I cannot do solo road trips anymore. The thought of being alone on the highway, of not knowing who is in the cars around me, of not being able to trust my surroundings fills me with anxiety. I only stay at well-reviewed chain hotels now, and I plan my routes obsessively, avoiding rest stops whenever possible. I am hyper-vigilant about everything, always watching other drivers, always looking for signs that something is wrong. My therapist says I am processing a traumatic event and that it will get better with time. But 2 years later, I am still struggling. I still see those fingers pushing against the gap in the trunk. I still hear those muffled sounds. I saved a life and I would do it again. But I cannot unsee what I saw, cannot unhear those sounds from the trunk. Every road trip reminds me how close she came to dying, and how many people might be driving past horrors every day without even knowing it. I have spent hundreds of hours trying to find this place again. I have looked at maps, satellite images, driven the same highway a dozen times. It is not there. But I know what I experienced, and I have a receipt in my wallet that proves I am not crazy, even though the receipt itself makes no sense. What happened to me on that highway in rural Pennsylvania defies every logical explanation I can come up with, and it has left me questioning the fundamental nature of reality. I was driving through Pennsylvania on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, heading from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia for a work conference. It was a straightforward drive, mostly highway, and I had made the trip several times before. But on this particular day, I had left later than planned, and by early evening I was getting tired and hungry. I started looking for an exit where I could get some food and maybe fill up my gas tank. That is when I saw the sign. Millbrook, gas food lodging, next exit. I did not recognize the name, but that was not unusual. There are dozens of small towns along that route that I had never bothered to stop in. The sign looked official enough, green with white lettering, the same style as every other highway exit sign. So when the exit ramp appeared, I took it without a second thought. The off-ramp curved down and deposited me onto a main street that immediately struck me as strange. Everything about the town looked frozen in time, like I had driven into a living museum exhibit from the 1950s. The cars parked along the street were vintage models, perfectly maintained, not a modern vehicle in sight. The storefronts had hand-painted signs and old-fashioned displays in the windows. Even the gas station I pulled into looked like something out of an old photograph, with rounded pumps and a sign advertising prices that seemed absurdly low. An attendant came out as I pulled up to the pumps. He was wearing a pressed uniform with his name stitched on the pocket, the kind of full-service gas station uniform that I had only seen in old movies. "Fill her up?" he asked, his smile polite and professional. Yeah," I said, confused by the whole setup. I assumed this must be one of those themed towns that capitalize on nostalgia tourism. "This is a nice place, very retro." The attendant looked at me strangely. "Retro? You know, the 1950s theme. It is really well done." He did not respond, just went about filling my tank. I got out of the car to stretch my legs and looked around. The few people I could see on the street were all dressed in period-appropriate clothing. Women in full skirts and cardigans, men in slacks and button-down shirts. A couple of kids rode past on bicycles that looked like they had come straight out of a vintage catalog. The attention to detail was impressive, but something about it felt off. It was too perfect, too consistent. In most themed towns, you can still see the modern world peeking through around the edges. A cell phone tower in the distance, a car with current license plates, a piece of contemporary graffiti. But here, there was nothing. It was as if the modern world simply did not exist. The pump clicked off, and the attendant came back around. "That will be $3.20, he said. I laughed, thinking he was joking, staying in character for the benefit of tourists. But his expression remained serious. "I am sorry, what?" $3.20, he repeated. "For the gas." I stared at him, completely confused. I had just filled a nearly empty tank. That should have cost me at least $40, probably more. "Are you serious?" "Is something wrong, sir?" He looked genuinely concerned, like I was the one acting strangely. I decided to just go along with it. Maybe the real price would show up when I paid inside. I followed him into the gas station office, which looked like it had been preserved from another era. There was an old mechanical cash register, glass bottles of soda in a metal cooler, and a rack of road maps instead of a digital display. I pulled out my credit card, but the attendant looked at it like he had never seen one before. "What is this?" he asked. "It is a credit card," I said slowly. "You do take cards, right?" "I do not understand," he said, picking up the card and examining it. "This is not... What kind of money is this?" My unease was rapidly turning into alarm. I looked more closely at the bills in the cash register drawer. They looked real, but something about them seemed off. The design was slightly different from modern currency, and the dates on them were from the 1950s. "Never mind," I said, pulling out cash. I handed him a $20 bill. He held it up to the light, frowning. "These bills look very strange," he said. "The colors are wrong and the printing is different. Is this legitimate currency?" I looked around the office more carefully. There was a calendar on the wall showing September 1952. A newspaper sat on the counter with a date from the same year. And everyone I could see through the window was still dressed in period clothing, still driving vintage cars. This was not a themed town. Something else was happening here, something I did not understand. I grabbed my change and my receipt and practically ran back to my car. I needed to get out of this place. I needed to get back to the highway, back to the modern world where things made sense. I started the engine and pulled out of the gas station, looking for signs that would direct me back to the interstate. But the signs I found did not help. They pointed to other small towns with names I did not recognize. The street names were unfamiliar. My phone had no signal, and when I tried to use GPS, it just showed a loading screen that never resolved. I drove through the town, getting more panicked by the minute. Everything looked wrong. The architecture, the cars, the people. And no one seemed to notice that I was out of place, that my car was from 7 decades in their future. I finally found a sign that said highway access and followed it desperately. The road led out of town and up an on-ramp. As soon as I merged onto the highway, everything changed. Suddenly, there were modern cars around me. The landscape looked normal. My phone signal returned and my GPS recalibrated, showing that I was somehow 40 miles past where I should have been. 40 miles past the exit I had taken to get to Millbrook. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my heart racing, and looked at my gas gauge. It showed full, which was impossible because it had been nearly empty before I stopped. I checked my phone for the time. I had been gone for maybe 30 minutes according to my memory, but my phone showed that 2 hours had passed. I pulled out the receipt the attendant had given me. It was printed on old paper, yellowed and fragile. The text was typed, not digitally printed, and it showed the date as September 17th, 1952. But the timestamp at the bottom showed the current year. The receipt existed in 2 time periods simultaneously, and it should not have been possible. For the next several weeks, I became obsessed with finding that exit again. I drove that same stretch of highway multiple times, looking for the sign, looking for the off-ramp. I zoomed in on satellite imagery, searching for a town called Millbrook. I found historical records showing that a town by that name had existed in that region, but it had been flooded in the 1960s to create a reservoir. The town had been completely submerged, every building, every street, every person relocated or lost. I found online forums where other people described similar experiences. They called them time slips, moments when past and present somehow overlap, when you can step from one era into another. Some people theorized it had to do with quantum physics, parallel universes bleeding into each other. Others thought it was spiritual or supernatural. No one had any real answers. I still have the receipt. I have shown it to people and they do not know what to make of it. The paper is genuine vintage, not a reproduction. The ink is from a mechanical typewriter, not a modern printer. But it references a transaction that happened in the current year. It exists as proof that I was there in that impossible town. I have stopped trying to find Millbrook. I realize that maybe some things are not meant to be found, not meant to be understood. I drove into a place that should not exist, a town that was drowned decades ago, and for a brief moment I existed in their time. I bought gas from a man who has been dead for probably 50 years, using money he could not recognize, in a car that would not be invented for half a century. I do not take shortcuts anymore. I do not take random exits just because they promise gas and food. Because I learned that some roads lead to places outside of normal time, places where the past still exists, where the rules we take for granted simply do not apply. And if you are unlucky enough to find one of those places, you might make it back. But you will spend the rest of your life wondering what you really experienced, and whether reality is as solid as you always believed it to be. Every region has its haunted roads, places locals know to avoid. In southern Louisiana, we had the Screaming Mile. I never believed the stories until I had no choice but to drive it. Growing up, everyone talked about that stretch of Highway 182 between Houma and New Iberia. They said if you drove through it at night, you would hear voices coming through your car speakers even if your radio was turned off. They said you would see things in the fog that rolled in off the bayou, shapes that looked like children standing on the side of the road. And they said that no matter how fast you drove, it always felt like something was chasing you. I dismissed it all as local superstition, the kind of stories that get exaggerated and passed down until they bear no resemblance to whatever minor incident started them. I had driven that highway dozens of times during the day and never experienced anything unusual. But I had never driven it at night, and I had certainly never driven it on October 15th, which was when the local legend said the activity was strongest. Last year, I found myself with no choice. I had been visiting my grandmother in Houma, and I had planned to leave early enough to get back to Lafayette before dark. But family visits never go as planned, and by the time I got on the road, it was already 8 in the evening. My GPS offered me 2 routes, the long way that took me around through Thibodaux, adding an extra hour to the drive, or the direct route through the Screaming Mile. I was tired, and I just wanted to get home, so I took the direct route. For the first 20 minutes, everything was normal. The highway was mostly empty, which was typical for a weeknight. The landscape on either side was the familiar Louisiana scenery of swamps, cypress trees, and the occasional house on stilts. Then I saw the sign. Historically significant area, reduce speed. That was the marker locals used to identify the beginning of the mile. The atmosphere changed immediately. Fog began rolling across the highway, thick and low to the ground, forcing me to slow down. The temperature seemed to drop, and I turned up the heat in my car. That was when I noticed my radio starting to act strangely. I had been listening to a podcast, but the audio began cutting in and out, replaced by bursts of static. I reached over to adjust the volume, thinking maybe I was losing the Bluetooth connection to my phone. But before I could touch it, the radio switched off entirely. The sudden silence was unsettling. I tried to turn it back on, but nothing happened. The display was dark, completely dead. Then I heard them. Voices. Faint at first, like whispers coming from the speakers. Even though the radio was off, even though the display showed no power, sound was coming through the speakers. I leaned closer, trying to make out what they were saying. And that is when the whispers became screams. Children's voices, dozens of them screaming in terror and pain. The sound filled the car, so loud and so real that I instinctively covered my ears. But covering my ears did not help, because the screaming was not just coming from the speakers anymore. It was in the air itself, surrounding the car, coming from everywhere at once. I pressed down on the accelerator, desperate to get through this section of highway as quickly as possible. But my car immediately began losing power. The engine sputtered and my speed dropped from 60 to 40, then to 30. I tried to give it more gas, but the car would not respond. It was as if something was physically holding it back, preventing me from escaping. The fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to almost nothing. My headlights barely penetrated it, and I could only see a few feet ahead. The screaming continued, rising and falling in waves of anguish. And then I saw them. shapes in the fog, small figures child-sized standing on the side of the road. As I crept past, I could make out more details. They were children, or at least they had the forms of children. But there was something wrong about them. They were translucent, flickering like old film projections, and they were all looking at me. My car came to a complete stop. The engine was still running, but it would not move. I was stuck in the middle of the screaming mile with ghostly children surrounding me. I locked the doors, which I realize now was a ridiculous gesture. Locks would not keep out whatever these things were. One of the figures moved closer to the car. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing clothes that looked like they were from the 1970s. He approached the driver's side window and pressed his transparent hand against the glass. Frost immediately spread across the window from where he touched it, radiating outward in delicate crystalline patterns. More figures approached. I could see them surrounding the car now, dozens of children, all wearing similar outdated clothing, all with the same desperate expressions. They began touching the car, pressing their hands against the windows, and everywhere they touched, frost formed. The temperature inside the car was dropping rapidly despite the heater running at full blast. I could see my breath misting in the air. The car began to rock. Gently at first, like someone was pushing on it experimentally, then more forcefully, as if multiple hands were shoving it back and forth. I gripped the steering wheel, terrified that they were going to flip the vehicle. The screaming was so loud now that I could not think. It filled my head, drowning out everything else. Then I heard a voice, clearer than the others. It cut through the chaos. A single child's voice, speaking instead of screaming. "Help us, please help us. We are lost. We cannot find our way home." Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of desperate pleas. "Help us. Take us home. We are scared. Do not leave us here. It is so dark. We have been here so long." Tears were streaming down my face. The sheer terror and sadness in their voices was overwhelming. These were not evil spirits trying to harm me. They were children, trapped and afraid, reliving whatever horrible thing had happened to them. I did not know how to help them. I did not know what they wanted from me. Through the fogged and frosted window, I saw the boy who had first approached. He was pressed against the glass, his face only inches from mine. His mouth moved, and though I could not hear his individual voice over the cacophony, I could read his lips. "Remember us," he was saying. "Please remember us." Then suddenly, everything stopped. The screaming ceased. The rocking stopped. The car engine roared back to life as if whatever had been suppressing it had released its hold. The figures began to fade, dissolving into the fog like they had never been there. Within seconds, I was alone on the highway, the only evidence of what had happened being the frost still clinging to my windows. I sat there for a moment, shaking uncontrollably, trying to process what had just happened. Then survival instinct kicked in. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and sped away from that place as fast as my car would go. I did not slow down until I was miles past the area, until I saw the lights of a gas station and pulled in, needing to be around other people, needing to be in a place that felt normal and safe. A local police officer happened to be at the gas station getting coffee. He took one look at my face, which must have been as pale as the ghosts I had just encountered, and asked if I was okay. When I told him I had just driven through the screaming mile, his expression changed to one of understanding. "You drove it tonight?" he asked. "October 15th? I nodded, not trusting my voice. "That is the anniversary," he said quietly. "The accident happened 32 years ago today." He told me the story I had heard fragments of my whole life but had never believed. In 1973, a school bus full of children had been traveling along that stretch of highway. The driver had fallen asleep at the wheel, and the bus had veered off the road and plunged into the bayou. 14 children had died, trapped in the bus as it filled with water. The recovery effort had been traumatic and the community had been devastated. The officer showed me a memorial marker that I had somehow never noticed before. It was a small plaque on the side of the highway listing the names and ages of the children who had died. I pulled up a photo on my phone that I had taken of the boy at my window and showed it to the officer. His face went pale. "That is Carter," he said. "Carter Broussard. He was 9 years old." The officer explained that dozens of drivers reported similar experiences on that stretch of road, particularly on the anniversary. The department received calls weekly about the phenomenon, but there was nothing they could do. It was not a law enforcement matter, it was something else entirely. I spent the next few weeks researching the accident. I found newspaper archives with photos of the victims. The boy I had seen, Carter, was there in a school photo, smiling and alive. I tracked down families of the other victims and learned their stories. I attended a memorial service that November where families gathered to remember their lost children. At the service, I met Carter's mother, an elderly woman now, still grieving her son after 3 decades. I told her what I had experienced, describing how Carter had appeared at my window, how he had asked me to remember them. She began to cry, but they were not entirely tears of sadness. "He is still there," she whispered. "My baby is still there and he is scared." I have made donations to the memorial fund every year since. I have participated in efforts to make the memorial site more visible to ensure that people remember what happened. But I have never driven that highway again. I add an extra hour to any trip if it means avoiding that stretch of road. I still have nightmares about that night. I still hear those screams sometimes when I am trying to fall asleep. But more than the terror, I remember the desperate plea in their voices. They are children, trapped in the worst moment of their lives, reliving their deaths over and over. They just want to be remembered. They want someone to acknowledge their suffering, to carry their story forward so they are not forgotten. I do not know if ghosts are real in the scientific sense, but those children were there with me that night. Their terror was real. Their pain was real. And now I understand why locals avoid that mile. Some places hold on to tragedy like a scar that never heals. The Screaming Mile is one of those places where 14 children died in darkness and cold water, and where some part of them remains forever calling out for help that will never come. Those children deserve to be remembered. Carter deserves to be remembered. And if telling this story, if sharing what I experienced that night helps keep their memory alive, then maybe that is the help they were asking for. Maybe being remembered is the only peace they can find.